Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest is Sami Timimi. He's a consultant focusing on child and adolescent issues. He's a psychiatrist as well since 1997. He lives in Lincoln in the United Kingdom, and we're going to talk about his work. So, Sami, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, tell me just very briefly about the work that you do right now, and then I want to ask you how you got into that.
So I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, which means I'm a doctor by training first, and then trained in psychiatry, and then from there specialized in child and adolescent psychiatry. And I've continued to work in that field in a clinical setting. I've worked in the National Health Service in the UK all my working life. And I've also been involved in various research projects around childhood and mental health and cross-cultural issues, quite a variety of things. And I've also been reasonably active in terms of writing papers, journal articles. I've been involved in 12 books now that I've either authored or co-authored or edited. And I also appear quite regularly in national and international conferences, and I do a fair amount of teaching and training.
Excellent. What got you involved or interested in working with adolescents in the first place?
Well, I started my training in psychiatry after finishing medicine and doing the basic medical training that you have to do before you get registered. And I became interested in psychotherapeutic approaches because initially working in general psychiatry on psychiatric wards, I could see that a lot of the time they felt like more custodial places for people who were either at risk of harming themselves or harming others. They didn't seem terribly therapeutic environments to me. So I kind of felt frustrated by the therapeutic possibilities in terms of the kind of more narrowly medicalized approach to helping people in distress. And then in the early 90s, I did a placement in child and adolescent psychiatry. And in those days, at least in the UK, child and adolescent psychiatry departments were mainly influenced by systemic thinking. So there was a lot of work with an understanding that children and young people and their problems and issues are connected to their history, the things that have happened to them, but also their broader environment, from what's going on with their parents to the schools, to the peer groups, and even to the cultural ideas that are floating around more generally. So that environment really appealed to me because it gave an opportunity to start learning different ideas, different ways of thinking about presentations. And I found the work with not just the young person, but their family and sometimes the broader system. It just made a lot of sense to me. And so it kind of drew me into that field of psychiatry.
When dealing with underage people, how do they group them by age? And do you think the age groupings make sense? Or does psychiatry just look at below 18 all the same?
That's an interesting question because it kind of brings to mind ideas about what we think about in terms of development and how people develop. Because ultimately, when we draw up these boundaries, these are artificial boundaries that we've imposed. And it's kind of interesting question in another way, because one of the things I've become very interested in over the years is trying to have a broader understanding of the cultural ideas and the cultural stories we tell. So one of the things that's, I think, very present in modern Western cultures is an idea of a timetable to which children and young people are expected to develop. So not just that we have things by year group ages in school, but we also have these timetables that parents get very worried about if they see their child hasn't, said the first word by a certain age, or isn't crawling by a certain age, or hasn't mastered certain aspects of what is thought to be necessary social skills and so on. So we do have a culture that thinks and tells a story, if you like, about how people develop, how children and young people develop, that's very mechanized and sometimes gives very little room for the variety of the ways in which children develop and become adults and find their own voice, and how we also have a kind of set of cultural stories that we also tell about families and about the idea of when young people should be considered as adults. So there's the whole thing about when legally they are considered as adults and what they're considered to be able to do at what ages. And we can see across the globe, there are different countries have different legal rules about a young person is entitled to do or is able to do at what age.
Quick question. Do you see any dislocations, meaning someone is, I'm just making this up, when someone's 16 in the UK, they can do X, Y, Z, but not ABC, but their problems at those ages tend to maybe stem from this inability to do certain things or stem from the sudden licensing or ability to do things because of their age. Like, are there any of these dislocations where age and law don't work well together?
I think there is the other bit that I was just about to say is in terms of our ideas about how dependent and independent we expect ourselves to be. So we have certain ideas about how independent children should be by a certain age. And in Western culture, we have what is thought of as a more individualistic orientated culture. So there is a constant push towards a sense of autonomy from young people. And there is a kind of suspicion about young people who continue to or find it hard to be outside of the fold of the family. So I was saying, but in other cultures that are more collectivist, we don't see that same push for young people to become independent, to become autonomous. In fact, there's often an expectation that people will stay very connected to their family.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
And will continue to need that support and connection from their family as they grow up. So this is a long way of coming back to your question about a sense of, if you like, for some young people, they can experience a conflict between, as they go through adolescence, between their desire to remain dependent and remain like a child who needs to be looked after, because those needs don't go away, and what they imagine they should be capable of doing. And so this idea that they should be able to demonstrate their independence and their autonomy. And for some young people, that can feel like a kind of exciting and liberating thing, but then that draws them into trouble sometimes, because developmentally they may not be quite ready to be out on their own, doing their own thing. And a lot of adolescents think they know everything, and their parents don't know anything, but then they realize that they get drawn into trouble very easily. But for some others, it can be the opposite is the issue. They find that independence actually overwhelming, and they want to draw back into the family and find the outside world a particularly challenging place. So you do have to take into account the circumstances of different young people and what's going on in their life and what's going on in their family and more broadly.
But what are some of the common issues that tend to occur at this age of liberation? I mean, what age does it fall in the UK? Like in the US, one watermark is 16 when you get your driver's license in a lot of states, and then 18 when you get more rights, and then 21. But what does it look like in the UK, and what are the associated issues or missteps that people make?
So in the UK, the main legal marks are 16 and 18, and particularly when it comes to treatment and issues like that, there is a much more flexible thing in the law, in terms of there is an idea that if the young person is assessed to have the capacity to make their own decisions, they can make their own decisions. They can consent to their treatments even if their parents don't consent to it. So, for example, with contraceptives. In terms of the types of challenges, I think one of the things that has become more of a preoccupation for me in my clinical practice, but also in my writing and research in recent years, has been trying to understand more what are the assumptions behind the models that we use to try and interpret and understand the experiences that adolescents are having, or children and young people growing up, but particularly adolescents, because adolescence is a time where there is lots of biological changes taking place, but simultaneously there are a lot of new psychological challenges taking place. You start to feel things more intensely. You start to have a sexual awakening. You start to get into more intense relationships, but you also start to think about the world in a much deeper way than maybe you have before, and start asking deeper questions like, why do I exist? What's the meaning of my life? What's my purpose? Is there something bigger than me in this world? Who finds me interesting? What is it that I'm interested in? What's my future going to be? All of these bigger existential questions come into play.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And one of the things that I've become increasingly alarmed about in our professional culture, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I've become quite critical of many of the ideas that we've been popularizing that come from a psychiatric perspective, because I feel that what we have been doing is, by increasing the amount of media coverage of an idea that many young people experience mental health problems, and most recently, certainly in the UK, I suspect it would be similar in the US, that this idea that COVID and the lockdowns has brought about a mental health pandemic alongside the infectious pandemic.
Yeah, tell me about that a bit. What have you observed from your patients due to the lockdowns and all that other stuff?
So what I was going to carry on to say was that there is this idea that the lockdowns has increased the likelihood of people experiencing mental health disorders, and therefore that we need to be much more on the lookout for diagnosing them and treating them. But the issue I have with that and our general way of thinking about distress in young people who are growing up is that when we turn what I would term ordinary and or understandable distress into an idea that it points towards something going wrong within the individual that is diagnosable in medical terms and treatable with, that we use medical labels and then we use medicalized treatments, whether these are using medication or using psychotherapeutic approaches, is that by accident, I think, in itself has become a cause of an increased rate of distress and alienation from that distress in young people. So, for example, just to help you understand what I mean by that, it is a perfectly understandable experience for a young person who has been told that they have to stay at home, can't meet up with their friends that they're used to hanging out with. School is all online and they're kind of 24 hours a day just at home. It would be highly surprising if a large percentage of those didn't feel unhappy, distressed, frustrated. Yeah, that would be a very understandable reaction. Lonely.
It's like being grounded by the government that there's no end to it.
It is, and not knowing when this will end or what's going to happen next. So people were reacting in very understandable ways. Yeah, you can understand that. These are part of the ways we are built as human beings. We are going to find situations like that quite distressing. Now, if you keep it in that framework of an ordinary and or understandable response to the circumstances that are happening in your life, the types of interventions that might be helpful are going to be much more to do with supportive interventions and to do with, helping them get their life back on track, reconnect with their social world and, get their material life up and running again as we come out of lockdown. Do you follow me? So in the realm of something that's kind of understandable to everyone. However, if you label those experiences as being the sign of a disorder, let's call it depression, which is a very common one diagnosed in young people these days, or anxiety. So if we start calling those experiences that you are now suffering from a clinical condition, it starts to the young people and their families and their teachers and whoever else is around will start to interpret what's going on as there's something gone wrong now as a result of what's happened, but something has gone wrong now in that young person. And that this thing that has gone wrong is beyond my expertise or beyond my ability as a parent or a teacher or a young person themselves to know how to deal with. We now need a professionalized response to that.
Yeah, that's like what's happening with ADHD. But in this,
exactly.
This was man-made. It's a natural response. But yet now It appears that they're medicalizing and labeling this and turning it into something completely different. And what will that do psychologically to these adolescents and their families? Like, what does that do besides, hey, a different perspective? It's understandable. Now it's time to get back out there and do your thing. I mean, so what do these two approaches tell you? How do they affect the patients differently?
So, you've got it. So I've come to realize, because I've been following the research, the scientific literature, my interest in trying to understand the basis for the conditions we are meant to be diagnosing started out with actually ADHD. That was the first one that I became interested in. And then it's, gradually grown from there. And one of the things that I realized when I started delving into the literature on ADHD is just trying to get a handle on what do we mean? What is it that's fundamentally or characteristically different about these children that means that they can be labeled with a condition that is thought to be something to do with their brain development. So the more I looked into this, the more I realized that this was just an idea. Every time people have looked in depth and have had a finding and said, oh yeah, we found a bit of the brain that looks a bit smaller on this group of kids from another research team looks at the same area and doesn't find it. So you have this problem of what's known as the replicability crisis. Nobody has been able to come up with any genetic scans or any brain scans or anything really that distinguishes children who would get a diagnosis of ADHD compared to children who don't.
So
it's an entirely man-made concept. So what's happening is there's a concept, and that concept, I think, I increasingly believe, is related to our cultural beliefs. So we have a cultural idea about how children should be. And if you
I've heard of tons of people saying, "Oh, I have ADHD. Oh, I'm so ADHD," and I could see this happening with the COVID stuff. Like, "Oh, I'm in COVID withdrawal, or I'm in society," whatever they decide to label this stuff. I guess people can identify with that and say, "I have this, I have that."
So I liken it now to reading your horoscope, your astrology chart. I don't know if you have that in the US, but in the UK, you can get a paper and they give you your star signs and tell you, this week something interesting is going to happen. You're going to meet somebody who will tell you something that will change, that kind of, that you can read into it. So if you look at, for example, an adult ADHD screening questionnaire and you're feeling a little fragile yourself, you'll identify with it because it's so non-specific. It talks about things that are so generalized that it's hard not to. And of course, so the way I think about these diagnoses, I've understood now that they are actually not diagnoses. They're not diagnoses in the medical sense. Because diagnosis in the medical sense provides an explanation for your symptoms. That's a system of categorization that's based on explanation. So if you have a chest pain, you go to the doctor, they tell you actually your chest pain is because of X, Y, and Z. It's because you've had acid reflux and you can breathe a sigh of relief. It's not to do with your heart, or because you've got a chest infection or whatever it is. They will do some investigations because you need to understand the cause of the chest pain. The chest pain is not a diagnosis. It's a symptom. You follow me? When it comes to something like ADHD, you're essentially saying that the cause of having poor attention and hyperactivity is the fact that you've got poor attention and hyperactivity. You're saying that the symptom, if you like, causes itself. This is an oxymoron. This is a philosophical circular thinking. It's a bit like going to the doctor and saying, "Doctor, I've got a headache," or "I've got a pain in my head." And the doctor says, "Well, the cause of the pain in your head is a headache." Low mood is a description. And to say that your low mood is caused by depression is just the same thing. It's a circular thing. You're just describing something. So a description cannot cause itself. Are you following me?
Right, that makes sense. I see.
So in psychiatry, what we call diagnoses are actually not diagnoses.
I don't even know what you call it.
They're descriptions. They're just descriptions. But in fact, what they've become in everyday life and in everyday social life is they have become brands. They have become consumer brands. So a market grows up, in a consumer market culture. What we get is a system of branding, and then around that brand, a market grows up with lots of products. You have Apple, and then Apple starts to make computers, and then it makes phones, and then it makes iPads, and then it makes funny watches, and then it makes all various software, etc., etc. And you have something similar. There's meant to be hundreds of psychiatric diagnoses, but we only know of a few of them because some of them are very amenable to the branding process because there is lots of money to make in a market economy. So you take something like ADHD. It's not just the fact that drug companies are going to make lots of money by branding their products as treatments for ADHD, but also professionals, researchers. People are going to write books. They're going to develop courses. They're going to develop specific therapies. There's going to be aids, there's going to be school things. You're going to get a whole load of products developing around the popular brands. So we find a few psychiatric diagnoses are all over the place because they capture something that is of common cultural concern. And so what you find is that there are, when it comes to younger children, the popular brands are those related to childhood behaviors, which is something that, of course, a lot of parents and teachers are concerned about. And they tend to be mainly aimed at boys. Boys is the main market. So ADHD and autism are big players, big brands in that market because they capture something of that type of anxiety that people are looking for some sort of solution for.
Quick question here. Is there a name for the psychological phenomenon of identifying something, labeling it, and then this whole world of stuff grows up around it, just as you're describing? Advertising, books, media conferences. Is there a name for that?
So I've called this, and I've written about this, I've called this the McDonaldization of children's mental health, of mental health in general, actually, but I've particularly written about the McDonaldization of children's mental health. That's the process that, that's, if you like, the label that I've used for that process. So as you go into adolescence and then into adulthood, the main customer market becomes women. Women are the main, and particularly the types of pressures that are on many women to try and hold together a family, hold together relationships at the same time as trying to keep a career going. So what you find is that things like depression, bipolar disorder, and increasingly, at least in this country, borderline personality disorder, and more recently, ADHD and autism have migrated into the adult world as brands and seem to follow the same pattern. So whilst ADHD as a brand is more common for boys when they're younger, as a brand for adult ADHD, it's much more common that the consumer is a woman rather than a man. So we see that same pattern because these are the groups that are most vulnerable to being out there looking for something because things in their life feel so difficult.
So how can, once something like ADHD becomes such a brand, as you call it, and has been McDonaldized, what pushback can there be? Or is it too late? It's just become such a big self-sustaining monster that there's nothing that can be done.
Well, one of the things that I understood from a clinical point of view is I began to realize some years ago that I was seeing an increasing number of people who had, this is young people, mainly adolescents and adolescents in their later adolescence, who were feeling very stuck. And they'd often had involvement with services for quite a time. They may have been on medication. They may have had diagnoses. They've often had several interventions, including psychotherapy interventions, but they just don't seem to be able to step out of whatever they felt in the grip of. And one of the things that I began to understand is the thing that they felt in the grip of was actually a unfortunate and accidental product of the systems that we have created. So once people start to imagine that what I call your ordinary or understandable emotional experiences, including deeply unpleasant ones. And a lot of the time, these are people who have had a lot of unpleasant things happening in their life. So it's understandable that they feel, the way we're built as human beings, if bad things happen to us, we feel bad, but that's not a sign of a disease. And what had happened to a lot of these young people is that couldn't get away from interpreting their experiences as being a sign of something wrong with them. So they spent a lot of their emotional energy trying to control their feelings or trying to suppress their feelings. This is what I call meta-emotion. How we feel about how we feel becomes an issue. One way of understanding that is, I'm sure you've experienced insomnia. Most people have. So after a few nights, usually insomnia starts because you got things on your mind, you're upset, you're distressed, or something that you need to sort out. But if you keep having, poor sleep night after night, then after a while, it's poor sleep itself that becomes the cause of that poor sleep. So at some point, insomnia causes itself because you start lying awake, worrying about whether you're going to get to sleep. And, and then you worry about how many more hours sleep will I be able to get before I have to wake up, if I have to go to work. And does that sound familiar?
Yep.
That process?
It self-perpetuates. Asthma is like that too. You feel like your lungs maybe are a little bit heavy. So then you take the puff and then you feel better. And it's a very psychological thing too.
Exactly. So there's a lot of things that, we can easily get caught in a cycle. And the thing for a lot of these people is what I realized is if you take that insomnia metaphor further, or analogy rather further, and you start trying to fix the insomnia, get rid of it, so you can get some sleep, and you find an app or something like that, and it works for a little while, then the insomnia comes back again, and maybe eventually you go to your doctor, you get some pills from them, and that works for a little while, but then it comes back. Each time either a remedy doesn't work, or it works for a while and it comes back again. Each time that happens, it makes you more hopeless and feeling more in the grip of this thing and feeling like whatever you do, you can't get rid of it. Do you follow me? However, so by accident, actually more treatment caused a problem that was essentially a short-term problem to become a long-term problem. If you replace the word insomnia with the word depression or the word anxiety, you will start to see how this process works. And what I realized is, from a clinical point of view, that the thing that I try to help people now is not to think about their depression or their anxiety as anything other than ordinary and understandable reactions. And in effect, to stop trying to get rid of them. It's more about learning to accept them into your life.
What happens psychologically when I've noticed this? I don't know if I can describe it right, but when someone gets a diagnosis, they either feel relief that they think now they have the answer, or they feel trepidation, like, oh shit, now I've been diagnosed with this, and their mind starts to say, I am diabetic, I am this, I am that. But what have you seen psychologically happens, and is there anything good that comes of this, or is it usually bad? Like, what are the two sides of the coin you see?
It's a very powerful process. I mean, sociologists have known about the power of labeling, from studies going back to the 50s and 60s, whether it was to do with labeling based on social class, based on race, based on all sorts of identifying features. So we've known about the power of labels and how they affect our interpretation, both of ourselves and how and affects other people's interpretations of us. And that has effects, of course, across medicine, but particularly when it comes to psychiatry, because the labels we are putting on people don't correspond to anything that we can measure in any physical way. So at least with diabetes, you've got a concrete measure to understand the impact of your treatments. Whereas for us in psychiatry, all our treatments are really based on a subjective idea. So what I think has been, if you look a lot at the evidence in terms of what's happened at a population level, is that as we've expanded our mental health treatments available in society in terms of both pharmacological treatments as well as psychotherapeutic treatments, but particularly pharmacological treatments, we seem to, rather than have reduced the number of people who are experiencing long-term mental health problems, as you should expect if our treatments were effective, we seem to have become particularly good at creating long-term patients. So we've got an increasing number of people who are now being identified as having long-term mental health problems. And for many, that includes quite disabling long-term mental health problems. So somewhere along the way, we've got things badly wrong. And even though, of course, the intentions have always been to try and help people, I guess apart from the pharmaceutical industry, whose intention, like any company, is to make profit. So even though our intentions might have been good, it seems that the systems we have created, rather than being good at helping people see their distress in the context of their lives and in the context of what it means to be a human being. The idea that we can be human without learning how to tolerate and be with and survive our distress. Instead of our services helping people with putting that interpretation onto their experiences and supporting them through that, we seem to have been good at, by accident, convincing people that they have concrete problems that are beyond their ability to manage and that require these special interventions. And that appears to have created a whole new set of people who are now identified as having some sort of long-term mental health problem. I often think that this generation of young people are the most pathologized young people in history, really, because we've never had this number of young people who we are identifying as having some sort of mental health problem. There was a survey done a couple of years ago in the UK asking young people if they believed that they have or have had a mental health problem. And 68% of this survey of 1,000 young people said they believed they had or have had a mental health problem. And out of those, 3/4 said that they had understood they had because of mental health awareness campaigns. So, this is the cost of us talking to young people in these kind of medicalized ways, rather than helping them understand their experiences as part of what it means to be human.
And what about the propensity of these conditions, again, once labeled, to seem to be lifetime conditions? So not only do you identify with it, but if you've quote unquote had this condition for years and decades, like it becomes you, and they get to medicate you for life, and you get to become this new thing for life. It seems like that's also where this is going as well. It's not just a temporary thing, like, oh, I have this problem, I broke my leg, it'll heal, and I'm not a broken leg. Like, I don't have broken legism, but if I'm labeled as being depressed or anxious or ADHD, whatever, it's for life, it seems like.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what happens when we start to imagine that suffering is something that should not exist in our lives and should be something that we are able to control and suppress instead of learning to live with and learning to, and that's the cost of that way of thinking, is that actually we are creating lots of people now who unnecessarily are identifying as having some sort of long-term mental health problem. And it doesn't have to be that way. If you look at some other cultures, so for example, in the Eastern religions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, the human suffering is not only seen as something that's inevitable, but it's actually seen as something desirable. In other words, that for growth to happen, people have to experience and understand and be able to stay with suffering. That's how personal growth happens in religions such as Buddhism. So, that's a very different framework within which to view suffering, and probably a more helpful one for us as humans.
Do you see yourself in any way as, I don't know, is this process so huge that can you intervene in it, or you just feel relegated to just helping your patients as best you can and not letting them fall into this, like, I am this diagnosis for the rest of my life? Like, what do you feel like your role is, and how can you help?
So I kind of vary between being optimistic and pessimistic on these bigger questions. Obviously, in my day-to-day work, I'm focused on doing what I can to try and help the young people who come under my care and under my team's care, so that we can hopefully help them have a less pathologized view of their experiences. But on the broader question, there is a large amount of critique going on, and there are quite a few different organizations, including service user organizations and professionals, including quite a lot of psychiatrists. I'm part of something called the Critical Psychiatry Network, for example, which is a group of mainly UK-based psychiatrists who have various critical perspectives, and we're quite an active group. We've published a lot, and we tend to get involved with issues to do with our Royal College, which is our organization that you have to be a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in order to practice as a psychiatrist in the UK. But there are other groups. There's a very active group in the British Psychological Society who have written some very useful stuff. And there are various campaigning groups. So another group that I'm part of is the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, because a lot of the drugs that we prescribe in psychiatry cause dependence and are very difficult to come off without help. So quite often people confuse withdrawal symptoms with an idea that their original condition has come back again. So this is a group that has recently influenced legislation in the UK. So we had a report from a parliamentary working group that has now recognized things like antidepressants, which weren't recognized up until recently as drugs of dependence. And so new guidelines have been going out to doctors in the UK. How far that will get, I don't know, but at least it's getting out there. So there are a number of groups around. So it does feel like there is an increasing groundswell. And I often think that, the old saying that you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, has some relevance. And I feel that because of the whole big black hole of science, that the structures that we're using and the systems of diagnosis that we have are so lacking a basis in science that sooner or later this will have to implode. And we don't know when that will happen and how quickly that will happen, but we know from history sometimes things that are waiting to happen when there's enough of a critical mass can happen very quickly. I mean, who would have saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and then within a couple of years the Soviet Union was no more? I mean, that happened very quickly, but obviously there had been years leading up to that. It's just that you don't know when that critical mass will be reached, that a system that has very little solid basis can crumble. So we shall wait and see.
But what does that mean, crumble? It's like, ADHD, or do you think it's going to be the whole medical system will somehow have to radically change, or do you think condition by condition, that's where we're going to see change, and how?
I think it will be the whole way of thinking about what we call psychiatric diagnoses having to disappear, because I think there will eventually be a wider recognition that what we're calling diagnoses are not diagnoses and doesn't have a scientific basis propping it up. So that's my hope. And then we will be able to get into a much more humane system of mental health care.
Any inkling as to what that would look like? Maybe just one or two features of it. I don't know if you're in your imaginings, besides saying, well, this isn't working, what do you estimate would work? Like, what would a healthier system look like?
We do have a number of reasonably well-developed models around. So I'll just give you an idea of a few of them. So of a model that appears to work extremely well, including with psychotic people who are much more at the severe end, is something called open dialogue. It's based on a kind of narrative therapy approach. It was developed in Scandinavia and involves bringing a network of people around the person and creating a safe space where different voices and different ideas can be understood, accepted, and viewing people's experiences as meaningful. And the task of bringing the therapeutic team, if you like, together, which is made up of professionals, but also the significant people in that person's life, is to help make sense of the situation. So that's one model that's had a lot of success. There's another model that's developed called the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is based on a trauma-informed care, which is about understanding how power has operated in somebody's life and looking at how you make a meaningful story that also includes an understanding of that person's strengths and resilience, and how you might help them build on their existing strengths, and again, connecting with the network around them. There are approaches that were developed in Italy around developing community care and involving the local community. So that's a much more activity-based, involves developing social enterprises and getting people involved in a kind of working together with professionals and other service users, doing things, running small businesses, running various things alongside a kind of therapeutic approach. So this sense of doing something purposeful rather than just sitting. So there are a number of models out there, and the final one I wanted to mention is something called feedback-informed treatment, which has also been gathering momentum. And this is simply the idea of co-constructing your therapeutic model. So instead of having a model that you impose passively on the patient, you get feedback about what's working and what's not at the end of most sessions, and you adjust what you're doing depending on that feedback, so that therapeutic process is jointly built up between the professional and the person. So those are a few examples. So we do have well systematized and well developed alternatives out.
Well, very good. So, Sami, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
I'm an author on the Mad in America website, and that's a really good website for lots of resources from lots of different people who've been writing blogs, reviewing research, writing original research. So if you just look up my name, I decided to serialize my latest book, which is called Insane Medicine, on that website. I do have my own website, which I'm fortunately, because I'm a bit busy, I don't often update it, but you could also go and see links to a few more of my books and articles. So that's samitimimi.co.uk.
Well, very good, Sami. Thank you so much for coming. I love your unique perspective, so appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.